And good afternoon, and welcome to this edition of your radio magazine, Voices of the Tri-States. Well, today, a little bit of history on tap for us, Dubuque history, in fact, and somehow how we always seem to be in the forefront of some national or some very prominent history. Joining me, I have John Pregler. He's a local historian, and with that, I say, hi, John. How you doing?
Hello, Cindy. Thanks for having me.
Well, John, I understand you're going to be presenting a couple of papers coming up here Sunday at the Carnegie Stout Public Library, and we're going to talk about those here. So, first of all, this is some pretty weighty stuff. How'd you get attracted to it's 19th century history, meaning in the 1800s? How'd you get attracted to this?
Well, first off, I've always loved Dubuque history. We're area of the country that has a lot of rich history. Everybody knows about General Grant and our relation to the Civil War and early lead mining and Indians. But in the 1980s, I had learned that my great-great-grandfather had served in the Civil War in the 9th Iowa Infantry, and he mustered into service here in Dubuque at a military camp. Okay. And at the time, I was unaware of any of that Dubuque history, so that really started me on my search for information on Dubuque and the Civil War, which led me to Carnegie Stout Public Library. All
righty, so we've got a couple of papers that you're going to be presenting. So let's take a look. First paper, what are we looking at here?
Well, the story really is going to intertwine 5 or 6 stories in a process.
Okay.
So the speech is On the Trail of Dubuque History Mysteries, utilizing public library research tools at Carnegie Stout Public Library. So I started researching about 30 years ago using different tools at Carnegie Stout Public Library, including the online and the microfiche newspaper film. And back in the 1990s, I had run across a advertisement for a Frederick Douglass speech in Dubuque at the Athenaeum Theater in 1868.
Where was that?
Which is currently the Five Flags Theater.
Okay, it was called the Athenaeum. Okay.
Correct.
But this was what was the date?
1868, March 3rd was the speech.
Okay.
So I made a copy of that clipping. At the time, the internet did not exist. So I made a photocopy of it, and I put it in my files for further research at another date. And I forgot about it. Then I gave a speech at Carnegie Stout Public Library in June of 2012 on Dubuque and the Civil War. And right after that speech, a lady, a local researcher and contributor to encyclopediadubuque.org, Diane Harris, had approached me with an image she had bought at a garage sale of a encampment, and on the back it says encampment, military encampment, Civil War, Dubuque.
Wow, that probably got you going then, huh?
And so she wanted to know if that was Dubuque's Camp Franklin or Camp Union, which used to be the military camp out at the corner of Shiras and Romberg, where the Eagle Point apartments are currently located. That used to be the mustering center for military during the Civil War. And after looking into the picture and looking at the landscape and whatnot, I determined it wasn't part of the Civil War. And what we discovered was it was taken by a local Dubuque photographer, Samuel Root, and it was related to Camp Henderson, a military camp in Dubuque in the 1880s. At that point, I didn't think much of it after that. That was about all the information I had found about it, so I didn't give it much more thought. Then last March of 2017 on eBay, I saw a silver pitcher, water pitcher from 1884 that was listed related to Dubuque and the Civil War. It was a presentation pitcher to the St. Louis Zouaves, which was a military unit, and they had won it in a drill competition. So I bid on the item, and I ended up winning it. And so I knew 1884 did not align with the Civil War, which was fought in 1861 to 1865. And I knew the Bush Zouaves were not part of any Dubuque unit through my prior research. So I started doing some additional research on the water pitcher itself. And had discovered it was related to a national military encampment held in Dubuque in June of 1884. And so I wanted to know more. So I remembered the image that Miss Harris had provided me, taken by Samuel Root. So I pulled that image back up and I started doing some research. Now the internet exists, and so wonderful research tool. And I found some other images of Samuel Root and Camp Henderson and the encampment, and I happened to run across an image of Frederick Douglass taken by Samuel Root.
Wow. You know, and I'm looking at this picture right now in front of me, and folks can't see it, of Frederick Douglass. And this is a picture that I have seen numerous times. And had you any inkling, you've probably saw this picture before you knew it was taken in Dubuque, any inkling that this was a Dubuque-based picture?
At first, I didn't have a clue, nor would I have guessed. And I started to do some additional research on Samuel Root. Had discovered he moved to Dubuque in 1857 from New York City, but he and his older brother were very early pioneer photographers, going back to 1839, literally some of the first photographers in the world.
Wow.
Because photography really came out in
Infancy,
1839, right. 1840 with the daguerreotype. And then he had moved to Dubuque after they made a name for themselves in New York City, photographing people like Henry Clay, P.T. Barnum, and General Tom Thumb, and other famous photographs that you would be recognized were taken by Samuel Root. And as I was doing additional research, I discovered that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person in the 19th century. My assumption would have been, or guess, would have been Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
But Frederick Douglass had more images taken of him than anybody else, than Lincoln, than General Grant, Mark Twain, or anybody. And one of those images happened to be taken here in Dubuque.
Wow. And this is one, I guess, like I say, I've seen it before, probably because he's sitting there, he's got a cane in his hand. And you said this was taken at the old, it would have been, some of the older Dubuquers would recognize the name as the Kresge Building or the Five and Dime. And that's where a studio must have been or something like that?
Correct. And so part of the what I call history's mysteries was the fact that the image was in several books that discussed Frederick Douglass and just images of Douglass. And in that book, none of them were quite clear when or where the picture was taken. I saw dates published of 1865, 1868, 1880, and even mention of potentially 1890, because in 1890 he was given a cane that looks very similar to the cane in the picture.
That he's holding, right.
And on the back of the image, there's actually a photographer's mark that stamps S. Root Gallery, 166 Main Street. We know that Root was at 166 Main Street, which is the corner of 8th and Main, in the 700 block, where today I believe it's Steel Financial Management Building, the old Kresge's building used to be. In 1867, Root moved across the street in the building which is now Cottingham Butler. And he operated from there till his death in 1889. So we know, since the image was marked in as 166 Main Street, and we know through research that Douglass actually spoke in Dubuque 3 different occasions, in April of 1866, in March of 1868, and again in March of 1869. We can only assume that the image was taken on April 20th, 1866, when he spoke in Dubuque.
Well, and this is the other thing, and I guess, you know, and again, I always find this stuff fascinating. Prior to you telling me this, I would never have guessed that Frederick Douglass, as famous as he was, would have been in Dubuque, period. Was this a big shocker to you?
It wasn't a huge shock. I knew that Frederick Douglass was a lecturer and would go out on lecture tours, and I also knew that Dubuque would hold lectures. We'd bring in people At the time, these lecture circuits consisted of politicians, military people, philosophers, religious people, Europeans that may be touring America, actors, singers, those types of things. So I knew that the theaters in Dubuque were very active with lecture series that were put on by the Color Christian Association or the Young Men's Literary Association would sponsor them. But I didn't realize that Douglas had been to Dubuque, let alone 3 times.
Well, and the other part about it is, I guess I always forget, is back in the 1800s, especially late 1800s, 40,000 residents. We were a bustling, hustling community for that day and age.
Absolutely. The other story that we'll be speaking about Sunday is the National Military Encampment in Dubuque in 1884. And Dubuque's population in 1880 was just over 23,000. And that encampment drew about 20,000 visitors to the city of Dubuque. So Dubuque literally doubled in size
okay.
For this 1 week's event.
Wow, that is pretty amazing. So we'll be talking about Frederick Douglass, also talking about this encampment. What was the encampment? I mean, we've got troops and people. What is this all about?
Sure. The National Military Encampment in Dubuque in 1884 was actually the largest military encampment post-Civil War up to that time. After the Civil War, the state militias, then known as National Guards, by 1870 would have their state encampments, and then some states would have regional National Guard encampments. And in 1883, C.S. Bentley, General Bentley of the Iowa National Guard, organized a National Guard encampment in Nashville, Tennessee, that they conducted very successfully. One of the Iowa encampments that he also held for the Iowa National Guard drew one of the federal officers from Fort Omaha from the 4th U.S. Infantry who was there to observe. And those 2 gentlemen started talking, and they thought it would be a good idea if National Guards and federal troops would get together in the same encampment and start drilling. Post-Civil War, each National Guard had their own form of drilling. Some used old Prussian drilling styles, some still used old Civil War drilling methods and training methods, and others had more advanced methods that were developed after the Civil War, and they really weren't shared. So the concept was hold a national encampment where you bring together federal and national troops, let them drill together, train together, share information and techniques, and see what comes of that. And William Boyd Allison and David Bremner Henderson, 2 Dubuque congressmen, were big champions and supporters of this national encampment and helped sponsor it in Congress.
Okay. And I want to remind our audience today we're talking with local historian John Pregler. And John, I'll mention this at the end of the program too, but you're going to be talking about a lot of the things we're talking about here today. This will be Sunday, right, at the Carnegie Stout Public Library.
Correct. Sunday at 2 o'clock from 2 to 3:30 in the Pregler Auditorium.
Okay. So the Henderson encampment, where was that located at?
So that was another one of history's mysteries that I discovered as I started to do more research. It was listed at the Dubuque Fairgrounds and Driving Park. And a driving park is a horse race track.
Okay.
And so,
I learned a new term. Okay.
So I started doing some research, and generally everything led me to what is known as Nutwood Park in Dubuque. And Nutwood Park was located out where John Deere Road and Highway 52 and the old Wicks Lumber area was, or the old Melody Mill. And so the assumption was that that was the location. Since we had an image of the encampment, I took the image out and tried to align the landscape with the image. And during my research of the National Encampment, I found 2 additional Samuel Root images from the encampment, one in the Iowa State Historical Society and one at the Dubuque County Historical Society. The one at the Dubuque County Historical Society was a picture of the horse race track and the amphitheater, and it was always believed to just be a horse race. But in fact, the image is from the National Encampment. And you can see the military tents set up and the fact that there's no horse racing going on. So I started to research more, and I started to work with Mike Gibson and Randy Lyon and other local historians. Mike Gibson at the Center for Dubuque History up at Loras College, and Randy Lyon, the father of Encyclopedia Dubuque. And we were all thinking that that Camp Henderson was indeed there at Nutwood Park. But as I started to look at some older 19th century maps, I started noticing on these maps that at Peru Road and Jackson Street, it would either be marked as fairground, or on another map I found driving park.
Oh.
So I started doing some additional research, and we started to discover that they always reference the driving park and the fairgrounds as related to the German Shooting Society. And just being past that right down the road.
Right.
Well, what I had discovered was the German Shooting Society used to be on Jackson Street. And that the original horse track and fairgrounds was actually at the corner of 32nd and Peru Road, where Flex Steel is. And that with the Minnesota Northwestern Railroad coming through in 1886, both the German Shooting Society and the fairgrounds moved out further out what was known as Sageville Road, or 52 North.
Oh my gosh.
So we were able to validate indeed that the encampment occurred right where Flex Steel, the old Flex Steel
building is today.
Correct.
Well, yeah, as I take a look, and folks, you can't see this, but I'm taking a look kind of at the hillside there. It's like, you know, you almost look at it, it's like, I know where that's at, but I can't put my finger on that. So.
And Sunday we'll have a slideshow that goes along with the presentation with a lot of images, all the images that we discovered of Camp Henderson, the image of Frederick Douglass, and some maps of where the different fairgrounds and driving parks were located in Dubuque. Now that we know that history and have cleaned up some misinformation and other stories about Nutwood Park and whatnot, now we have a clearer understanding of where and when certain things occurred.
But that is interesting of, you know, just thinking that, you know, okay, the Shooting Society of where it is now, that, you know, it just moved a little bit further down the road. But if you were doing your research thinking, oh, that's where it always was, it kind of discombobulates you a little when you're trying to, you know, put all this stuff together, I would imagine.
Absolutely, and that's one thing you run into researching history, whether it be local, national history, or family history. My great-great-grandfather, who served in the Civil War, served in the Western Theater, and I know he was at Vicksburg. He died in 1936, and in our family obituary written by the family, it said he was at Gettysburg. There was no way he was at Gettysburg. We know he wasn't at Gettysburg, but it's just one of those oversights that gets written down once and then perpetuated and needs to be corrected at some point. So you run into a lot of that.
Well, and that, again, that makes it kind of tough for researching because, again, it becomes, is it a story from the past? You know, it obviously must have been somebody knew he was at some battle and it was a big battle, but they didn't know which one it was. So, but yeah, once you get that corrected, what was the easiest thing, I guess, of both of these papers? What was easy for you and what was the most difficult?
The most difficult was probably knowing when to stop writing the articles.
It probably really is like because one road leads to the next, to the next, to the next, right?
And there's so many stories within the story. Regarding the National Military Encampment, not only do I talk about the encampment from a military aspect and who all participated and the different drills that went on during the week, but I also talk about the carnival-like atmosphere, the fact that gaming licenses were issued, which were unusual in the city, both for at the fairgrounds as well as certain bars, and certain religious societies in Dubuque took issue with that. They
Little protest maybe?
They were very concerned about open drinking and gambling 24 hours a day during this encampment.
Oh my gosh.
Every day there was basically in the police beat, in the local newspapers, lists of the pickpockets and thieves and people who were arrested.
The unsavory came along with it too.
Exactly. When you go from 23,000 population to having over 40,000 people in town for a week, you can imagine that there's some misgivings going on by some people.
Wow, my goodness gracious. But, like I say, it really is exciting, some of the stuff that has gone on. So And I know you've got plenty other, things that you're going to be talking about, so we don't want to give it all away here. But what do you find just most exciting about all of this stuff? I mean, there's got to be something you're like, wow, this just, really pops for me.
Well, besides just the intrigue and the discovery and knowing that these things happened in Dubuque and were tied to national events and national people, is really, as you start researching one topic, discovering a morsel of information that relates to something else and all the other research topics. I have a list of a variety of things I want to research and demonstrate or prove about Dubuque. Things like, was Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the box with Lincoln when he was assassinated, was he assigned to Dubuque as a mustering officer for the 12th U.S. Infantry at the beginning of the war? We believe he was. We know that one of his college classmates was from Dubuque and was a mustering officer here. It was mentioned in the Dubuque Herald that it was a good chance he served in Dubuque for about a year. We do know that his uncle was here serving with the same unit. And we also know several hundred men from Dubuque served in the 12th U.S. Infantry, Henry Rathbone's infantry. So I'm trying to put together those pieces. There are stories of Jesse James and his history with Dubuque, but there's no way to put a finger on a newspaper article or a specific item that says, yes, there may be something to those stories, but the stories and the folklore, and there's a lot of folklore about Jesse James, some of it seems like it could be very well true. I'm trying to figure out exactly when Abraham Lincoln was in Dubuque in 1859. I think I've got that narrowed down to a date in July, and I have found an article from 1903 from William Boyd Allison where he spoke to the New York Sun-Post, where he recalled meeting Lincoln and seeing him in Dubuque, so we have some validation there. So just these little stories that have loose ends that I'm trying to find validation, citations for, and bring those stories forward.
Wow, how neat! What for your doing your research? What is the best tool? Like, say if somebody just wanted to do some of this research on their own, is it the internet, or is it really sometimes even like you say, go to auctions or eBay or things like that and see what's out there?
Well, some of the best are talking to locals, seniors that remember stories or remember their grandparents telling stories. You hear a lot of good information and little tidbits of information there. Carnegie Stout Library, whether you go there in person or use their online research services, has all kinds of links to the old Dubuque Herald and the old Dubuque Telegraph Herald. You can do research online or go there into the library and research. They have the city directories. I use that a lot to see where people live.
Fascinating, huh?
Great advertisements for businesses. You learn a lot about people and where they lived and how they migrated around and what businesses did and those types of things. So wonderful resources there.
Alrighty. So, and again, on Sunday, if folks want to come see your talk, where and when?
So it's this Sunday at Carnegie Stout Public Library from 2 o'clock till 3:30 in the Pregler Auditorium.
Okay, very good. Folks, this sounds like it's going to be just a fascinating kind of a trip back into the 1800s or 19th century, however you want to call it. And John, anything else you'd like to add before I let you go?
I hope to see everybody there.
Okay, very good. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Cindy.
And again, folks, John Pregler, a local historian. Folks, as always, join me right here, 12:30, Monday through Friday. So for today, for Voices of the Tri-States, I'm Cindy Coleman.